Hello, everyone. Sorry for the short break for those of you who stayed for the end of Anja's presentation. I am going to transition to the topic of textile history, textile as art, textile as meaning that can hold, well, textile is something that can hold meaning far beyond what we were exposed to with Anja's presentation. It doesn't just have to be something that comes onto the human skin and worn around without consciousness. We all know that our community is very much part of ascribing meaning to material culture. And the next two, well, the next presenter and that space that we're crafting with her after her presentation explores textile as it means so much more than what we've again been exposed to earlier in the morning. So okay, I'm going to introduce our second two speakers. So, just one moment. Thank you. All right, so Karen is going to be presenting. Karen Hampton is an internationally recognized conceptual artist. She is addressing the issues of colorism and kinship with the African-American community, within the African-American community. She is recognized as a literal and figurative storyteller who weaves together textures and colors of the ancient world with that of an imagined future. Material and imagery are part of the methodology that she uses to access her ancestral and personal heritage, using her training in the fiber arts with her training in anthropology. She is synthesizing the role of weaver with that of griot, the storyteller, if I pronounce that correctly. Hampton's art practice easily flows between different fiber surfaces and materials to complete each story. Her practice has led her to the role of being a leader in the field of textiles and fiber as a voice of the underrepresented BIPOC in the field and into the position of Vice President, President-elect of the Textile Society of America. Hampton's artwork is held in the collections of the Ruth and Elmer Wellen Museum of Art, Hamilton College, Clinton, New York, and the Honolulu Museum of Art in Honolulu, Hawaii. In 2008, she received the coveted Eureka Prize from the Fleischhacker Foundation. Hampton is an assistant professor at Massachusetts College of Art and Design, Boston, Massachusetts, and is the vice president of the Textile Society of America. Incredible work, Karen. Thank you for joining us today. And please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. I've been following this organization from the beginning, and I'm really excited to speak with you today.
We're honored to have you here, and I'm so grateful that you were able to make time. And so we've been following you too. And you're going to also be joined by a colleague and friend, Teju Adisa-Farrar. If it's okay, I'll just present her bio and then you can take it from there and have time for your presentation, and then you two will begin your conversation. So Teju Adisa-Farrar is a Jamaican-American environmental equity consultant and researcher. She centers climate, racial, and distributive justice by sharing ideas on regenerative practices and co-collaborative design. She uses social geography's perspective, encouraging us to think about space, place, and identity. Her lens includes sustainable fiber and fashion systems, urban ecologies, nature, Black history, activism, and art. She supports people, collectives, and organizations who are mapping and making alternative futures. And she fully embraces that bio in all the experiences that I have had the pleasure of working with her through and within and continue to. And Teju, you will be working with the RFMI next year, just to let everyone know, mapping a future of real textile economic justice in our community is happening. All right, so Karen, please take it away, and I will unmute or mute.
Okay. Okay, hello everyone. I'm gonna screen share and it may take me a second to get it to play. Okay, worked pretty well. Hello. I was thinking about, well, what did I want to say to you in a short period of time? I think what I wanted to say was that my trajectory as an artist shifted about 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I was trying to figure out where did I fit into the textile world. I had already been a weaver then for about 15 years. And I had met so few African Americans that were connected to weaving that I was really trying to figure out where did I fit in. So this is a little bit, I'll give you a little bit of my story and I will share with you some of my work with indigo in the period that from about 2000 to about probably 2012, something like that. One of the things that I do is that I am a storyteller. I collect stories. I've collected them my whole life. And much of my storytelling comes from the fact that my grand aunt was my primary caregiver, who also was Jamaican. And from her, that was how I learned about the world, was from her stories. Oops. These are a few of my pieces. I weave and I stitch. And I just collect stories of, when I found this, I had this void of stories from people that look like me in textiles. I started the process of really combining the two parts of myself, which was that my training in my undergraduate work was in art and anthropology. And so I really sought to combine the two things and to find voice in it. And so using a number of different techniques, I started weaving and telling some different stories. You can ask me questions about the techniques. I'm not going to talk about them now. The stories that I tell, I've gathered from visiting when I was in grad school, from 1998 to 2000, I conducted some field work and I traveled and visited 11 plantations. And when I did that, what I was left with was, I was left with the feelings. I was left with the visions that I had walking on the grounds. Those were the days when especially brown and black people were not visiting plantations. And these, especially the central piece and the piece to your right, were both pieces that I created after visiting the Hampton plantation. The piece on the left is a piece I did years later, and that was after my travels in Nevada and visiting one of the oldest petroglyph sites, and really, really trying so hard, thinking about our environmental degradation and just survival as a species. And I kept thinking and feeling, the feeling that I kept getting was that we had to go and we had to talk to the ancients. And I was at a location where where the petroglyphs were made between 10 and 12,000 years ago. Some of the other work that something I've been working on for 20 years now. I'm about to have a show in March in St. Augustine, Florida. And it was a moment after graduate school where all of a sudden I was given access to my ancestors dating back 200 years ago. And this is one of the pieces that came from that. And it was the moment where the connection between the work I had done through the Carolinas and finding out that I had this Florida history, where all of a sudden history became ever so real for me. This is yet one more piece about my Florida work and the discovery and the story of Black and brown communities in northern Florida under the Spanish. And that's all I brought to share with you. But I can certainly answer any questions, and I look forward to speaking with Teju.
Thank you, Karen, for sharing some of your beautiful artwork. I know people are excited to continue to support your work. And I first want to ask you about why textiles as a medium. What is it about textiles and dye, specifically indigo, that you feel like is the best way to share and express your art and your story and your lineages?
Well, there are two things that, for me, textiles were the natural thing for me. My grandmother had been a seamstress in New York, and my mother, who was an accountant, the time when she was happy was when she was in the sewing room. We had a sewing room in our house, and I was a pesky child that just did anything to get to spend time in the sewing room. And so I was sewing my own wardrobe by the time I was in like 9th grade. And then I just, as I like to say, my ancestors kind of picked me and put me where they wanted me to be, to have the opportunity to learn to weave when I was 17. And that was the moment where I knew I was going to do that for the rest of my life.
I think it's interesting that you noted that you didn't see a lot of textile stories about Black people and Black communities, because so much of that is embedded in our culture and passed down to generations. My grandmother, she did needlepoint, she knitted, she sewed. My aunts were seamstresses, and even going back to the enslavement of Africans in this country, and not only planting and picking cotton, but also weaving it, looming it, sewing it as well. And even before that, in tropical Africa, which was a center of cotton production and indigo production. So it is interesting that these stories are not really heard or seen in the textile sort of information that we see. And I also know that in my family, textiles are reused and passed down. And once something can be used as clothes, it was used as a rag. And then it was used as something else. And then eventually the scraps were used for something else. So could you talk to me a little bit about your use of fibers and textiles that have already served a functional purpose in your art?
Oh, I have been into repurposed textiles from, I would say, since the early 80s, when I began working on a line of women's jackets, and I was gathering my materials from dumpster diving and collecting, because I lived in the garment district in San Francisco. And a neighbor turned me on to the fact that there was so much waste going into their dumpster that I began to collect things, and then to figure out how first I was making rag rugs, and then from the rag rugs, I began to develop a line of jackets.
And what is it about your approach to textiles and fiber that is grounded in the connection to the land and the communities and your stories? Can you talk a little bit more about how you interweave all of these topics in your art?
Ooh, okay, so the very base of it, I remember back in the early 90s when I was thinking about, I was really, really thinking about, what I was doing and really going, well, is this really going to be, is this like what an art practice can be? Because I hadn't seen anyone doing anything like what I was doing. But I just figured it didn't matter that, if Picasso could have beautiful women as his muse, then I could have history as mine. And because I loved this history, I loved finding out more, learning more about myself and the cultures of Black and brown people, that, and I realized that as I collected stories, it was so healing for me that I knew that if I got that much, then maybe other people might gather things as well. And it was very lonely in that early period, but I just kept doing it.
And what were people's responses? How were people responding to your art? What was the impact that you felt like it was making on people's understanding of Black relationships to textiles and the environment?
It was accepted. People didn't quite know what to do with me. They didn't really know what to do with me. It was like, oh, aren't you supposed to be a quilter? Was more the response. I go, no, I'm a weaver. And, and I just was doing it. I was, in those early years, in the 90s, I was teaching at College of Marin. And so, I would imagine that some of my former students might be on this call. That it was a very, I just would share. I would just share. I would tell people what I was doing and why I thought it was so important. But really, I was doing it to heal myself in those early days. So, I was going to do it no matter what. And I knew that it was something that I had to do. There was no question about it. As time went on, and I really kept, when I started getting into my own family's history, as opposed to, more generalized stories. First I was interested in, I remember my first interest was in the continuity of culture through diaspora. So I had that kind of question first. Then I started going, well, what was my true art? And so I started creating different kinds of problems for myself to solve, to begin to learn things. Then it was, okay, now I'm getting into my own family's. No, then it was getting into really learning the real history of this country, because I knew almost nothing. I had been a child of busing in Los Angeles, and I was one of the first 27 kids in voluntary busing in LA. And so I really had zip as far as knowing my own history. And so I really set out when I was in grad school. And the question really came about because I was giving a lecture on my work, and someone that was in the audience asked me, and she was white, and she said, in my line of work, I go into a lot of people's homes. why is it that I only see looms in white people's homes? And this was right before I went to graduate school. And I just said, bingo, there's my question, you know? And so I just spent 2 years just learning everything that I could, and making conceptual work about that, about early colonial history. I was looking at North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, the Low Country. And I was looking at cotton becoming king, indigo is the second oldest field crop, and plantation weaving. And there was nothing, there were no books at that time that could give me that information. So I had to do primary research. And then from there, so I had the skills when I was all of a sudden given this wonderful opportunity to see that I had this family history that really covered so much of the same ground as I was already covering. And you know, and to find that indigo was there, and that there was just so much richness in knowing and understanding the economics of slavery in this country, was just, it empowered me so much. I had been so shy. I cannot tell you how shy I was in up through until about 2000, when I started to really come out of my shell more and more.
I think it's really important to understand the history of this culture and recognize that textiles and fiber, and specifically cotton, is a conversation about the economy of this country. And so I think as Black people in the Americas, healing is so much a part of the conversation as well. And I appreciate that that is a primary approach to your work, because of the tumultuous and sometimes violent relationships Black people have had to land in this country and in the Americas more widely. Healing our relationship to the land is like a sort of tiny reparation we could give to ourselves. And as we're having these conversations about how to live more sustainably and what needs to be transformed to continue humanity, part of it is healing our relationship and reconnecting to the land. And so you've been able to use your history as the catalyst, and your art as an expression of that, and to discover all of these links that go as far back as the continent of Africa and throughout the diaspora, such as indigo. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your garden dyeing and your natural dyeing and how that shows up in your work.
Well, so in the late 70s, I apprenticed with the master weaver dyer, Ida Gray. And I worked with Ida for a year and a half, and she had just finished her book, Nature's Colors, at the time. And working with Ida was one of the high points in my life. She had the grounds where her home was, her homestead, the dye garden was the first place that you entered. And whenever anyone came to visit, the first thing that you did was you walked through the dye garden. And so I was like an apprentice, and I didn't have any money. So I was working for any chance I got. And so in that time, I first began really getting to know dye plants and getting to know Latin names and everything. She encouraged me. I remember going and taking my first garden. I was always a gardener, but taking like a farm workshop from John Jevons in that period of time. And then later I ended up getting the opportunity to rent the garden project in Covelo, California, which was a famous garden site, and really learning so much from the Alan Chadwick, who had established the garden site, getting to be there and getting to see how things survived and what, you know, really understanding things in a much deeper way. And that was the period when I first grew, Japanese indigo. And then I had worked with, and that whole period, the way I describe it is that I had never used chemical dyes until I think I had been weaving for about 12 years. Everything was natural dyes. I started spinning and I was really a back to the lander. You know, and in recent time, and I was fighting so much because at the time, the university system was really where textiles were being taught, was really poo-pooing natural dyes. And I just did what I did. And years later, when it started coming, finally, everyone was starting to really see what the issues of sustainability were and the health concerns and everything else. You know, it's been really lovely to be back in a position where I could have, this year I had an experimental dye garden in the town where I live in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is, you know, weaving history kind of place. And was able to get a plot of land to really start growing dye plants and to see how they did in this environment. So, you know, it's like my love. My love is, and my dream is to be able to have some land again and be able to do my thing.
Well, that's amazing, Karen. Thank you for continuing to fight for those natural materials. And if you could just let us know how we can find out more information about your St. Augustine show, I'm sure people would love to support. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us, and I'll turn it back over to Rebecca.
Oh,
Thank you.
Karen, Teju, thank you both so much. Karen, I just learned so much about, just to hear Covelo, College of Marin, like, oh, you are teacher, you are you carved a path for yourself, but you carved a path for so many others. I feel like your work with Ida Gray, your work with Alan Chadwick, I mean, my generation is behind you. Thank you for providing that. And of course, I feel like I have so much more to learn. So again, this conversation feels short.
Well, I just wanted to say, you know, that I really believe in each one, teach one. You know, that no matter whether you're in an academic environment or not, it's just so important to teach.
Yes. Yes. We have that, I guess I call it my responsibility when I get to learn from someone like you or Ida, or I got a little bit of learning from those who studied under Alan, which is what you get this beautiful information, and it is our responsibility to keep teaching. I keep reminding myself that. Thank you for that re-inoculation. Feel so uplifted. Thank you both for this, and I hope we get to speak more and collaborate more, and hear your story more. Thank you, Teju, for beautiful facilitation.
Thank you so much.